Today we're talking about the book of Ezekiel. When we cover the book of Ezekiel, what we want to talk about is Ezekiel's background, two parts of his life. The big focus we are going to spend the bulk of our time on is going to be his vision in chapter 1. Then we'll talk about Ezekiel's understanding of sin, and then also we'll talk about Ezekiel in the valley of the dry bones. Background. Key thing to understand about Ezekiel is he is a priest who is working in the temple before the Israelites, before the southern kingdom is destroyed by the Babylonians. In the year 597, the Babylonians defeated the Israelites, but they didn't destroy the temple, and so the Israelites lived on another 10 years. But in the year 597, the Babylonians did take some Israelites, some of the people from the southern kingdom, into captivity. And Ezekiel, because he's educated by virtue of being a priest who works in the temple, he's one of those people, so he gets taken into captivity, and he's going to live in Babylon for the remainder of his career. So who he's going to prophesy to are going to be Jews living in exile in Babylon. At first, just a small group who are living in exile while the nation of Israel or the southern kingdom of Judah still lives on. But then eventually it will be all of the people who are taken into captivity by the Babylonians in 587. So that tells us who he's going to be preaching to or prophesying to. What it doesn't really, what we also need to take note of is that because he's a priest, he works in the temple. A lot of his prophecies are going to focus in on the temple and its importance to the theology of Israel. All right, so we've got two parts to Ezekiel's life then. We've got the first 6 years of his career, which are going to be emphasizing that, look, guys, the nation, the southern kingdom, Jerusalem are eventually going to be destroyed. Don't think that we're going to get to go home. Don't think this is just a temporary setback for us, because it's not, because we're actually in big trouble here. Then in 586, after they get news that the temple has been destroyed, that Jerusalem's been defeated, he turns into a ministry of hope in which he says, just because we've been defeated doesn't mean this is the end of our country. We can still persevere through this. All right, that gives us the basic background to Ezekiel. Now I want to take a look at a couple of slides here that may not make a sense to you guys here. I've got a couple of different images here over the next couple of slides. The reason for this is that imagery in the book of Ezekiel is extremely important. What we're looking at here is a picture of Saturn taken by the Cassini space probe back in 2006. We recently intentionally crashed it into Saturn, so it's no longer out there, but it was out there for quite a long time. This is one of my favorite pictures in the whole world because, well, I just find it I just find the whole thing awe-inspiring to me. And so I like to talk about it for a second here. What I think is cool about this is that the outermost rings, towards the edges of the picture, we didn't know that those existed because this is the first photo of Saturn taken where it's backlit by the sun, and as a result, those rings were too faint for us to observe from our perspective on Earth. So I like to look at this picture. I just kind of get a sense of awe and wonderment about the universe here and about how big it is. That's why I like this picture. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about what kinds of thoughts or images come to mind when you look at this picture here. So go ahead and pause the video and do that for a second. Okay, hopefully you did what I asked you to do and you thought about this. And many of you recognize this picture. It's a picture of the Marines on Mount Suribachi during the Battle of Iwo Jima in World War II, raising the flag up. And so usually when I go through this exercise, I get a lot of students say that they see that the images or the thoughts, the feelings that are brought to mind by it are hope, courage, bravery, heroism, patriotism, that kind of stuff there. This is an image that is easy to understand for us. Now the next picture here, I want you to look at here. Look at this picture and do the same thing you did on the last one. Go ahead and pause the video for 10 seconds and just think about, what do you see here? Okay, hopefully again you contemplated what you saw, and oftentimes a lot of students will start off by saying, wow, this is really, really weird. And it is a very weird picture. After we get past that, oftentimes I get responses about people will see chaos, sometimes people see panic, sometimes people see death, those kinds of things. The reason why you see this is because that's exactly what the painter wanted you to see. This is a painting by Pablo Picasso, and the painting is entitled Guernica, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but somebody will have to, perhaps somebody can tell me how to pronounce it correctly. But the painting was painted to capture the feeling of what it was like to live in the Spanish city of Guernica during something called the Spanish Civil War, which took place in 1937. And what happened at Guernica was it was the first time in human history in which an Air Force carpet bombed a target. And what I mean by carpet bombing is they simply just dropped their bombs without having a specific target in mind. They just were trying to simply level the whole city. It became a very popular tactic in World War II, but this was the first time in human history this had ever been done. And I think that Picasso, despite the fact the image is very weird, I mean, it is undeniably strange to look at. It gives you a sense, it seems to capture, I think, the emotion of what it probably would have been like to have this awful, horrible weapon of war unleashed on you for the first time in human history. You see this chaos, you see death all around you, you see body parts, and it would just be absolute madness going on there. Now, the reason why I want you to look at these things here is we see that images can have a profound effect on us, whether we understand them or not. So, the reason why I'm having you focus in on these images and try to understand what's significant about them, or try to get thoughts and feelings from them, is that the book of Ezekiel uses imagery a lot. And whereas Amos is going to preach at you, as I tried to do and probably made a fool of myself, screaming at my computer the other day, he wants to preach at you. Ezekiel wants to do weird things and create images and paint word pictures for you so that you understand what it is that he's talking about. And so if you read through Ezekiel chapter 1, it's very easy for us to be very dismissive of the book of Ezekiel and just say, the guy is insane, he's weird, he's weirder than Picasso's painting that we're looking at here. Now, what I would love to do at this point, if we were in class, is I would love to have you guys come to the board and I would love to draw what is in Ezekiel chapter 1. Um, we obviously cannot do that. And so what I want to encourage you to do, I think it'd be great if you would try to do this for yourself. Read through the chapter and try to sketch out the image here. And if you want to do that, I strongly encourage you to pause it and do that and see what you come up with here. Now, you don't have to, if you did the drawing, I think that's awesome that you did that. If you didn't do the drawing, it's okay, because here we do have a picture of Ezekiel chapter 1 here on the right of this slide. You can also Google, just type in Ezekiel 1 into your Google Images search, and you'll come up with other drawings and pictures. Some are better than this one, some are not. What I'd like to do is kind of briefly take a look at this picture and see what this image communicates to us, so that we can not be so dismissive of Ezekiel's strange imagery and see that there's actually a lot of meaning in it when we stop to learn it and figure it out. Okay, so what Ezekiel's going to do is he's going to first see a vision of this creature that's depicted on the, well, it's the weird looking creature sort of in the middle of the picture there. It's got different heads, lots of wings. It's got a lion's head, it's got a human head, it's got an ox head, it's got the face of an eagle. If we take the time to really work through this, take the time to think about what kinds of thoughts or images are communicated to you by a creature that has lots of wings, that's big, strong, powerful, has the head of a human, which probably represents intelligence, the head of an ox, which perhaps represents strength, the head of a lion, which might represent courage, the head of an eagle, which seems to represent perhaps, you could talk about swiftness, you could talk about sharp eyes. There's probably a couple of different things you could come up with there. But if you combine all those attributes together that you would find in a weird creature like this, I think usually most students in the past have been able to come up with the conclusion that what we're talking about here, or what we're looking at, would be a creature that has all the character attributes of, and I'll do a dramatic pause here and see if you can answer the question for yourself, God. And maybe that doesn't, maybe you would disagree with that, and so we'll move over to the wheel here, which might help you understand this a little better. Now, it's a wheel within a wheel construction, so it's basically the framework of a ball or a sphere. And so the beauty of something like that, the technical term for this is gyroscope, is that it can move anywhere. And it's got all these eyes all over it. Which means that it can seemingly see anything and everything all at the same time. And so this wheel within a wheel construction thing seems to have the ability to go anywhere and see anything and everything. Well, once again, I would suggest that it has all the attributes of, now big dramatic pause, God. And so these two weird things, the wheel within a wheel that Ezekiel describes, and the creature that he describes, have all these attributes that would probably best be applied to God. And yet, in his vision, he talks about one seated on a throne above the firmament in the sky, and that must be God. And so these weird creatures, which have all the attributes of God, they're not actually God themselves. They're servants of the living God. And so what the imagery is communicating to us is this idea that God is still in control and is still powerful, almighty, all-seeing, all-knowing, all those kinds of concepts that you would ascribe to God, even though his people have been defeated. Because from the perspective of an ancient person, if your country's been defeated by another country, that would seem to imply that your country, or excuse me, your God, is weaker than that other country's God. And yet God reveals himself to Ezekiel, a captive in Babylon, and gives him this message or this vision that would communicate hope. God is still here, still in control, still big, bad, powerful, almighty, all that stuff, despite the fact that Ezekiel is a defeated person. Now, the reason why I linger on this here is A, because I want you to understand the vision, but B, I want us to understand Ezekiel in a new way and not be dismissive of him as this crazy person. And he is a little weird. I mean, he's a lot weird. But just because he's a lot weird doesn't mean we have to be dismissive of him. Instead, what we can do is we can simply say, this guy, despite his weirdness, crafts word pictures which are designed to create artwork for us. And we're meant to think about that imagery. And so the meaning of the vision is often found more in the sense of the image rather than the words itself. And I would suggest that this would be an appropriate way of understanding not just Ezekiel's vision, but also a lot of other visions that you would find in the Bible. The book of Revelation is, of course, a good example, but the book of Daniel, some of the book of Zechariah, these are other books of the Bible that have weird, strange, crazy visions or dreams. And oftentimes, if you take the time to really think about what's in the vision, or at least Google the image and see what somebody else has come up with, by thinking about that, you'll get meaning out of this. More than, and you won't need to just dismiss this as, well, I don't understand it, so I'm going to move right along. All right, so I think we've got a good sense of Ezekiel chapter 1, so let's move on to more discussion of Ezekiel here. We see a lot of symbolic actions that he performs in chapters 4 and 5 here. He does some very weird things here, especially if you look at the second to last bullet point here. He is asked to cook his food over his own dung, which is gross. Let's call it a spade here. But not only is that gross, that would be unclean. That would be inconsistent with the law. And so he convinces God to change it to cow's dung, which I guess is better. So that it would not be, so that he would not be ritually unclean. Well, why do we do this? Well, if it's gross to cook your food over dung like that, then that gives you this icky, nasty feeling. And that's the way the Israelites are going to feel when they're in exile and not able to keep the law. It's going to make them feel icky, gross, and nasty. And so Ezekiel's communicating what life is going to be like for them. When he cuts his hair and scatters it, that's a symbol of what's going to happen to the Israelites. They're going to be scattered all over the world for the next 40 some odd years. Another vision Ezekiel has is in chapter 10, where he sees the temple being destroyed. Before that happens, we see God leaving the temple, which is a symbol of the fact that God has withdrawn his protection from the Israelites. And so he's preaching to those who are in captivity with him in Babylon. Look, guys, the end is coming. We're doomed. We're all going to be destroyed. Skipping ahead to Ezekiel chapter 18, we talk about what's going to happen in regards to sin. In the law, it emphasizes the idea the sins of the father are visited upon the son. Now, we oftentimes interpret that verse to mean that, well, there are consequences for our sins that may be passed on to our children. And that's probably a fair interpretation. But the ancient Israelites believed it quite literally, that if your dad sinned, then you could be punished for his sins. And if that's the case, the nation of Israel as a whole has sinned. And so future generations of Israelites could be held accountable for previous generations of Israelites' sins, which would make it very difficult for them to gain forgiveness and gain control of the land of Israel. And so Ezekiel says that a time is coming soon when individuals are going to be held responsible for their sins and only their sins, not the sins of their father, their ancestors. And this is going to create the opportunity for the Israelites to gain repentance from God, or to gain forgiveness from God. Then moving on, we see that Ezekiel is told when his wife dies he's not to react, just as Israel is not supposed to react to the destruction of its temple. When that happens in the future, a very tragic thing for both Ezekiel and the Israelites. When news reaches them that the Babylonians have in fact defeated the Israelites and have destroyed the temple, as Ezekiel has long prophesied, Ezekiel, to his credit, doesn't go around saying, "Told you so." Instead, he transitions into a ministry of hope. The most famous image of hope, perhaps even the most famous image in all of Ezekiel, is chapter 37, the Valley of the Dry Bones. A lot of people have seen an image of resurrection in this, where we see all these dead, dry bones sitting in a valley, and God says, "Ezekiel," or rather he calls him mortal, "can these bones walk again?" And Ezekiel's not dumb. He knows that God's asking him an obvious question, but he knows that there's a trick question. There's a trick answer in there somewhere. So Ezekiel says, "Well, surely you know, O Lord." He passes the buck on to God. And so when we see all these dry bones there coming back together, it does seem like an image of resurrection that Christians will experience in the afterlife. And that's an okay reading with me. But again, in the immediate context, what God is trying to emphasize here is that Israel and Judah, two nations, are as dead as these dry bones, have no business coming back from the dead. Countries that have been defeated by big, powerful empires in the ancient world do not come back from the dead. And yet Ezekiel dares to prophesy, at least symbolically, that the Israelites can come back from the dead, they can return to life, and that God is going to make that happen, just as this valley of dry bones receives life, and these bones begin to have flesh put on them and begin to walk again. And that leads to the final, very lengthy vision of Ezekiel, the vision of the restoration of the temple, where the temple is rebuilt. And in chapter 43, the glory of the Lord returns. The temple would, in fact, be rebuilt. It would be dedicated in the year 515, thanks to the support of Cyrus the Persian, who we talked about in our last nerd session. For the Israelites, when they rebuilt the temple, that was fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy. There was always a lingering sense of doubt, though, amongst the Israelites. Was God in the temple, in the new temple? Had he fully forgiven the Israelites? Had he come to inhabit the temple? Was the glory, had Ezekiel chapter 43 been fulfilled yet? And that would be a question that would linger with a lot of Israelites, even until New Testament times. And so, to a large extent, the New Testament, with Jesus returning, especially when Jesus returns to the temple and claims ownership over the temple in some of the New Testament passages. Those could be taken to be fulfillment of prophecy of God himself returning to the temple. But the thing that I want to emphasize here is that just because Ezekiel's vision of the temple is restored does not necessarily mean, though, that the Israelites fully bought into the idea that the glory of God had in fact returned. And throughout the rest of their time, really from the time of Ezekiel until the time of the New Testament, there was a very long lingering sense of doubt about, had God fully forgiven the Israelites for their sins, which led to the destruction of the first temple and the conquest of Jerusalem. And if God had not forgiven them for their sins, what was it going to take for that to happen? And that should help us. I'm not going to develop that theme a whole lot more here. I'm going to wrap this up in a second. But hopefully that helps set up your understanding of what the situation was like in New Testament times. Hopefully your New Testament professor will be able to build on that idea a little bit more here. All right, as always, if you have questions about something, I know I am going through these quickly. I'm going through these quickly in hopes that they'll be easier for you to listen to rather than have to listen to the full lengthy hour and a half long sessions that we usually have. So please do email me if you have questions. I am here to help you. If you don't have questions, or if I don't hear from you, I wish you all a good evening, and I hope that you continue to stay well and healthy.